I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 52 of EO Radio Show. This is the fifth in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In episode 38, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. In episode 40, we focused on the state filings in Nevada and Arizona, and episode 43 looked at Washington State and Oregon. Most recently, in episode 47, we addressed Alaska and Hawaii state filings. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we leave the West Coast states and jump across the country to look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in New York and New Jersey. Then we'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in the previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person in the state. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. And this is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, nor do we talk about the specific tax or qualification rules, but instead, we're focusing on the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar housekeeping matters. As with all the states we've discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit corporation in New York or New Jersey, or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit corporation may need to have a legal presence and be registered in these two states. So this is what we'll dive in today is the registration process. And again, if you have specific questions about your new entity and its tax and compliance burdens, check with your local counsel to make sure that you haven't missed any details. So today, I'm happy to welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, and he's been working a great deal on real estate purchases and vendor contracting throughout his career. Thanks for joining me again, Joe.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
So let's start with New York today. Walk us through the document needed to form a nonprofit charitable corporation in New York, and then we'll also talk a little bit about the foreign organization that wants to operate in New York. But let's just start with forming the new nonprofit charity in New York State.
For sure. So the Department of State, what they refer to as the DOS, governs New York entity formation. They have a form, Articles of Incorporation for domestic documents and domestic formations. Their fill and form is one of the most robust we have seen since we started this project of discussing the states. It has a section for specific purposes of the corporation and an additional article section for IRS-required specific provisions. Make sure that your 501c3 meets those IRS standards. All original directors must be named. And there is a minimum of 3 that need to be named for the state. And the domestic entity will also need to file an initial report online. Here, the state of New York recommends this be formed as soon as possible after formation. I think we've discussed similar When we talked about Washington, for instance, where we did them, we talked about doing them at the same time. This is something we would recommend here, obviously, in New York as well.
It's always easiest to do these filings right up front before anybody forgets.
Yes.
What about the foreign nonprofit? What do they do to get themselves qualified in New York State?
So for the foreign nonprofits, there's a separate form, what they call an application for authority. While it is similar to these articles, so there are a few differences. It too needs to have the purpose of the nonprofit named, but further, it also asks for the specific activities the nonprofit proposes to conduct in New York. So that's a little more specific than the general that we often see of like charitable activities and that. There is no need here, though, to note directors or officers in the actual application. So that's kind of an interesting change from what we've seen as well, where that's often something that drives even the applications of the foreign.
And what's the cost for these filing fees?
For the domestic, it will be $75. And for a foreign application, it's $135. And as always, remember to include any service fees associated with the agent you've chosen, their annual pickup fees.
Okay, so that's great. So how much time do we need to allow to get the filing back? Is New York a quick turnaround state? What does it look like from your experience?
While the New York DOS website does not note a standard processing time, just basic research into that notes that as of August right now that it should be an online filing should be within 7 business days, which is kind of norm for what we've seen, such as here in California and some of the other states we've looked at. And here, while mail submissions here could take up to 6 to 8 weeks, again, which isn't unusual, we see that as a larger turnaround always. The DOS does have expedite available. It's a $25 fee for a 24-hour review, $75 for a same day, as long as you have them in before noon Eastern Standard Time. Obviously, since we're talking New York, always a big deal when we're on the here. Some of us who've dealt with Delaware filings as well, that our afternoon is already after hours there. So always think of that if you're a West Coast client thinking, a West Coast nonprofit thinking of registering on the East Coast on a rush, think of the timing on that side too in terms of the days. And then they actually have a 2-hour expedite for $150 as well. And that must be hand delivered or faxed in before 2:30 Eastern time.
All right. So that's pretty early in the day if you're on the West Coast.
Yes.
If privacy, disclosure, transparency concerns for filing your articles in New York, I think you said already that the initial board members have to be named.
The initial board needs to be named for a domestic, but not for a foreign. And really, other than that, we're much closer to the Delaware of a high end of privacy versus, say, what we talked about in some of the other states where we had officers and directors. And as we go into New Jersey, we'll talk about a lot more that needs to be dropped out. But yeah, this is pretty high privacy here in terms of what you have.
Yeah, not a lot of personal detail.
No.
Talk a little bit about the annual filings due in New York State.
Okay, so New York has a biannual, so every other year statement based on the date the entity formed. So the filing period for a nonprofit corporation is the calendar month in which its original certificate of incorporation or the application for authority was filed with the DOS. So similar to what we see here in California again. For instance, if we form today, when we're recording, August 21st, our first statement will be due the month of August 2025. And you'll have the whole month. So essentially by August 31st, 2025 would be your last date to do it. There are some interesting particulars to their statements. It will need to note the name and business address of its CEO, the number of directors constituting the board, and more particular, how many directors of the board are women. So they track in the background. They do certain statistics for that. It doesn't seem to affect anything other than probably a statistical that the state's doing, but that is kind of an interesting, different thing that we've seen before.
That is the first time we've seen that come up at this level in the Secretary of State filings. So we file a statement every year. What's the fee for that?
Their fee is only $9 to file, and you file it online. That's the same for both the domestic and the nonprofit. There's no change there. There isn't any expedite on this, but it's a simple checkbox that you file online. Click, 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 and you're filed within minutes. Again, this is similar to California, where California, you get within 30 minutes of doing the click box online, you get a form. That's how New York posits theirs as well.
Okay, so that's pretty quick and easy.
Yeah.
So switching to another really unusual thing that we haven't seen before in New York, the DOS apparently has special rules for lobbying organizations and charities that fund them. So we're going to use lobbying as shorthand for a 501c4. Technically, those organizations can do things other than lobbying, and not all C4s are lobbying organizations. But anyway, talk to us a little bit about these unique rules that the New York Department of State requires for filings by organizations that are lobbying directly or funding lobbying organizations.
If our charity gives in-kind donations such as HR resources, office space, or office supplies to a lobbying organization, and the value of those donations exceeds $10,000 for reporting period, and their reporting periods are basically 6 months. They divide the year in half, January 1 to June 30th, and then July 1st to December 31st. And then if that lobbying organization they donated these to is required to file a source of funding report with the Commission on Ethics in Lobbying Government, which is a very long name for a New York agency, then a funding disclosure report will be due to the DOS as well by our charity. So again, this is not something we've really seen prior, where we've had this tied to you donating to a lobbying entity.
Interesting. So that's a lot to unpack there. And I guess the takeaway is, without going into a lot of details on what these rules would cover, is that if your nonprofit organization that's registered in New York is going to be engaged in direct or indirect support of lobbying activities through a C4, better check with counsel and make sure you've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. So that's a trap for the unwary, I suppose. Let's shift gears a little bit. What other state agencies in New York State, and also I want to drop a kind of mental footnote here, New York City has other filing requirements, as do many of the major cities, but we're just talking about state filings here. So what are the other state agencies in New York that our charity needs to have on their radar screen?
As with most of the states we've discussed, most of our charitable organizations that have assets or engage in charitable activities in New York or solicit charitable contributions, including grants from foundations and from government grants, are required to register with the charitable bureaus, which is with the state's attorney general's office. Again, that's similar to what we see here in California, where the AG's office runs this side of things. Additionally, for obtaining any state tax exemptions in New York, the nonprofit will need to apply with the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. They have a lot of separate forms for exemptions from sales tax, exemption from property tax, all of those exemptions that will need to be reviewed as appropriate for the nonprofit.
Okay, so there's a charities bureau, and presumably you register with it, and then there's annual filings there, and then the tax rules. So there's a lot there in New York. I know from experience that New York is one of those states that, like California, keeps a close eye on its charities. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about New Jersey. Very close geographically to New York State. Let's see how close they are in terms of regulatory structures. What do we need to do to file in New Jersey as a nonprofit?
Well, we're definitely going to talk about some different things here. In New Jersey, the New Jersey Treasury Division of the Revenue and Enterprise Services governs the formation of entities, which is even longer and more garbled than Secretary of State and Departments of State. And here we see something very interesting. All for-profit and nonprofit corporations, LLCs, LPs, and LPs must first obtain their EIN, their employer identification number, from the IRS before applying.
Weird, because you're getting the EIN before you're an entity.
Yeah. And I mean, again, we would always recommend registering first and then obtaining the EIN, especially as there may be naming availability issues within the state itself. Just last week, I had one where the client came back with about 3 or 4 names, and quite frankly, all 4 of them were already taken and unavailable. So we had to think about it. So, over the course of these podcasts, we've talked about doing a name check with the state prior to drafting your articles and drafting your bylaws anyways. But here we see a real need to confirm that prior to filing anything in New Jersey, to make sure that you've really got a name that's going to be available. And as always, when you come the show notes here, we will link to each state's specific name check sites within their website, so you can pull that real easily and look for them. But yeah, here we're really talking about doing a lot of diligence prior to even thinking about anything else.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Get your EIN first if you're going to be in New Jersey as a new nonprofit corporation. But if you're already in existence, a foreign organization that's going into New Jersey, you've already got your EIN because you already exist.
Correct, yes.
So walk us through the filings for the foreign organization that's entering New Jersey, the foreign charity, and then the domestic nonprofit.
We're going to see something unusual here, too, because as we've discussed just now, they have a certificate of formation / authorization that gets filed online. The New Jersey website is not very user-friendly to look at any of the forms themselves. It just wants you to go through the process of push the buttons, next step. But they do have a in the links again, we'll see it. It's a 55-page PDF that's called Public Recordings Filing for a New Business Entity, and it has all the forms in it. And most unusually, as you go through it, all entities, whether it be a corporation, a nonprofit, an LLC, an LP, or an LP, all file the same form. And that form is also the same for both domestic and foreign. They have one form stuck in the middle of this 55-page PDF that you can pull up and look at. Within that form, though, and within the notes on it, it actually gives some very specifics for registering as a nonprofit.
So just to be clear here, it's a web-based form.
Correct.
And you go to the same website no matter what you're planning to be. And you better have this 55-page PDF handy so you know what to do box.
I'm trying to get away from being a paper person, but quite frankly, if you're thinking about this, I would print out at least probably half of that and put some notes onto it to have it in front of you as you register. And we try to get away from paper, and I don't print out things paper like I used to, but this is one where I think it actually would behoove the person to sit down and think about this in the old-fashioned, old-school way.
So I have a New Jersey nonprofit corporation that I want to get incorporated in New Jersey. Walk us through the specific details of how to click through that form.
For sure. And we're going to go a little bit more granular than we usually do here, just because this is a good, interesting example of what this form does, where we've talked about forms more on a higher level and people can print them out, but we'll talk about this one because it has some very specifics, which are interesting. As you go through the form, it has a specific section that's called Type of Business Entity, and you can enter then just the initials NP. And then when you go to the next one where it says business purpose, you include the 501c3 purpose wording that's required by the IRS. So what you put on your 1023, you will just regurgitate here and put into the form. And then again, this is good to look at when we think about that, because these forms do often have stock, non-stock. So here where it says that you have stock, you make no entry. You just leave it blank, which is unusual because a lot of times we would put NA, you would think you would want to do that, but the state specifically says leave this blank. Then
if you're a nonprofit, non-stock.
Yes, non-stock, yes. And then in management, where they have a management section, they want you to list 3 members of the board of directors or the board of trustees, however you have it put together. And then directly below that, they have an additional entity-specific information insert. And then you can just put your C-attached 501c3 requirements and add them as an attachment as you go through the filing. And then on that attachment include your IRS required restrictions. And then the next one below that, you'll have something that says domestic nonprofit corporation. And under that, you're going to put the method of distribution as set forth and include all your 501c3 dissolution wording required by the IRS. Again, we've sort of brushed over this in terms of like state stuff, but this is things we've talked about where we've filed and put together the 1023 things we've got in our bylaws and stuff. So you're going to start duplicating some of that language into the form. It's a very wordy way of saying that the form is not nearly as robust for the nonprofits as there are a lot of attachments, but it has to be done off the forms. And after filing the certificate of formation authorization, then you need to file a second form, which is their tax employer registration form, which is the NJ-Reg, NJ-REG. This too is included in that 55-page PDF, and the New Jersey preference is for this to be filed online as well. The NJ-Reg is also a one-form-fits-all for all entities. It too has a 501c3 specific question section, and if the nonprofit is requesting sales tax exemptions, we're already seeing this with your initial filing. We've talked about just previously in New York where you would file separately with their Department of Treasury. Here it's something that you're doing right away. And it requires you, we've talked about these when we talked about why in Washington, that we require your NAICS to be in place already and have that there. And there's also a New Jersey specific business code section that you go through. Again, there's about 3 of the 55-page PDF. There's about 3 pages of different business codes that are New Jersey specific.
Those are New Jersey codes that are similar to the NAICS?
Yeah, they're only like 3-digit. I believe they were 3-digit or 4-digit. So it's a much smaller subset, but it's the same idea, yes, of what you do there.
NAICS, it's easy enough to do a web search and find the list of national numbers that are used basically for statistical purposes at the federal level.
It's the North American Industry classification system. It's always that I for industry that throws, especially those of us that do nonprofits, because we don't necessarily think of ourselves as being an industry. So I think that's what throws us off when we think about it.
Well, and your new nonprofit is going to need that NAICS code for the 1023 anyway, so you're going to have to look it up. But this New Jersey specific business codes, that's new. Or anything else in that PDF or in the filings?
We talked about while they were maybe required to register for tax purposes, and we're going to put that on this form. They're not subject to a proof of registration requirement when contracting with other public agencies in the state. That was kind of interesting. It had that carve out. We'll go right into privacy if that's okay. Because because we're talking about this tax side of it that's in the NG Reg that you're required to file. So the initial filing we talked about, you just needed the 3 board members, which was fine. But in the reg, because it's tax oriented, it requires a social security number and home addresses of responsible corporate officers.
Oh, interesting. I know a lot of corporate officers that do not like to provide their social security number anywhere. So New Jersey is going to be a stickler on that detail.
Yes, that's this is not something we've seen prior, again, because we haven't really looked at where we've had to file tax exemption stuff in terms of getting registered. So this was kind of an unusual. Again, it's driven by the business licensing and covers tax and employer registrations on this form as well as that. That's why. So the state kind of wants to roll everything into that initial filing. So it is something to think about having. Again, it doesn't say that you have to have the president has to register and the treasurer has to and the secretary. It just refers to it specifically as a responsible corporate officer. So in theory, you could have just one person that's the responsible here that's, yes, like you said, is willing to put their address and social security number on the form.
So Joe, tell us about the cost for filing in New Jersey. How pricey is that filing fee?
So the filing fee for a domestic New Jersey nonprofit will be $75, and for a foreign nonprofit will be $125. So it's similar to New York. It's about a $50 difference between the domestic and the foreign.
And how long do we need to allow for this? What's the turnaround time for New Jersey filings?
Per the FAQ on the New Jersey website, online filings should be confirmed and be able to be downloaded as soon as the fees are paid. More realistically, current wait time that we saw online was from 1 to 2 business days, where you look at the local firms that actually filed them. So that's still pretty reasonable. There wasn't really an expedite mentioned on there. It was just you do the filings.
Well, because you basically have to do it online anyway.
Yes,
so
there's not
unlike the other states, the expedite usually comes into play.
Yes, for your mailed.
Yeah, good point. So do it online and expect it back in 1 to 2 days. What do we need to calendar for annual filings for our foreign nonprofit that's in New Jersey or the New Jersey incorporated entity?
So the annual report is due every year on the last day of the month and the month in which you completed your business formation. So again, if we form today, August 21st, our first reports will be due August 31st, 2020, by August 31st, 2024. So we've got 1 year from that. The filing will be available 1 business day after filing for their website. So it's the same thing. You register, you do it online, and then that's available. It says, too, when you go through that, you must download a copy of the annual report within 90 days of filing, or it will no longer be available for your download. Otherwise, you'll need to order a copy through their services and pay for it. So best business practice is always, as soon as you get your filing copy, to download it. But we know things always happen. Again, if it comes back the next day and you don't get to it. And so think about that to remind yourself that you should, when you get the email from them confirming, to make sure that you have what you need for your corporate records to confirm it. Because as we all know, the websites can be kind of funky. You may not be able to get into it when you need to prove that you're registered. We've all been through it. We talk about this all the time. For the banks need a good standing in the office, need one sooner rather than later. And often that can help you with, here's my current filing. So
handy to have it, especially since it's usually just a couple of clicks to get it at the time you file it. And going back to redo anything always takes so much longer. So what are the annual fees?
So for a nonprofit, both foreign and domestic, the annual report fee is $30. And then depending on how you pay it online, it's either a $3 credit card fee or a 50-cent e-check fee. So you can set up your accounts on there. Either way, that's not too unreasonable.
So what are the other New Jersey state agencies that our nonprofit, either foreign or domestic in New Jersey, needs to think about?
So if you're a nonprofit there, it has a headquarters in New Jersey, or if it solicits in the state for donations, it must register with the New Jersey Division of Consumer Affairs, Charities Registration and Investigation Section.
That's a long title.
It's a long title, but basically it's their AG's office also. And then as we've talked about, there are tax exemptions that these will need to go through for the New Jersey Division of Taxation, the Regulatory Services Branch. Again, that you've already started that process just by having the forms in place to register. And then lastly, if the nonprofit wants to run raffles or 50/50s, there's a separate registration with the Division of Consumer Affairs, Legalized Games of Chance Control Commission. As always, all the links to these are in the show notes. So if you're thinking about doing this in New Jersey, by all means, check out the links.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for going through all these details and corralling all of the show notes for today. There's quite a number of links. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and thanks so much for putting all this together. So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes, like I said, for links to resources in New York and New Jersey, and links to earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. Also, Farella, Braun & Martel now has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including the one we are building where all the state filing episodes will be in one place. So look for that link in the show notes as well. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, you may want to check with local counsel on the specific issues for your new nonprofit corporation, including tax and compliance matters in these states and any other states where your nonprofit will be operating or soliciting charitable contributions. So with that, I'll sign off now. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.